It's almost the time. Let's start, guys. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you here. Nice to see that there's that much people looking forward to this webinar. Before we actually start, let me remind you that you are more than welcome to ask any questions that you might have during the webinar or just in mind, or you already maybe had some planned questions while you are planning to attend this webinar. And it would be really great if you will leave them in the Q&A section, or in other words, question and answer section, and we will go through them closer to the finish of the webinar. Additionally, if you want to receive the slides, make sure you leave your email. And I would be very grateful if you leave this email in the chat. And if you do not want to for someone to see this email, except me, of course, then well, just send it not to all the panelists and attendees, but specifically panelists, since I'm the only panelist that is here. So as I see by the chat, the sound is good. That's great. I see that you can hear me. I see some of you already are sending emails, some of you sending strange hashes, but well, I will hope that that's okay. It's not something with the chat itself. So let's move on to the advanced problem detection and how can you make your Zabbix more precise in terms of reporting to you what's actually happening in your system. Are there any problems, of course, and how to make the reporting of those problems as efficient as it might be, needs to be, and must be. So the agenda for the webinar itself is, well, quite quick introduction to how does Zabbix work overall. Of course, we will take a look at the basic and advanced ways of detecting a problem. So we will take the simplest functions about how they behave, what is more efficient, what is less efficient, what you should use, what you might consider using, and so on. And of course, different possible reaction scenarios that are available in Zabbix, starting from the emails and ending with your own custom scripts, not only webhooks, of course. So what is Zabbix? For those of you who maybe yet does not know and are just thinking about actually planning to use Zabbix, well, Zabbix, in short, is just as written in the slides, in an enterprise level open source monitoring system. What does that mean? That means that Zabbix is absolutely free. You can download Zabbix at any given moment just by going to the zabbix.com and download the Zabbix server, Zabbix frontend, Zabbix agents, all the components of Zabbix absolutely for free without any kind of charge. And you will get all the product, a complete product without actually any enterprise editions existing, and you will be able to do whatever you need to do to get the metrics, and of course whatever you might need to change in the front end. Like for example, if you are interested in changing, let's say, the logo, making it your own and so on, that's also absolutely possible without any limitations. And while it is free, and usually when we see something free and open source, some of you, especially might be some of the companies considering the product, know that like, well, it's open source. Still, we are mature, we are high quality and reliable team of developers and engineers who produce a quality product that is still easy to manage and is all in one product, keeping everything that you just might need to achieve your monitoring goals. And while Zabbix can do a lot, that's just precisely because Zabbix itself is a very flexible product in any terms, in terms of metric collection, in terms of notifications, in terms of visualization of the metrics you collect, and of course, specifically in the theme of our webinar, the problem detection itself. So just to remind you, how does Zabbix data flow happen, how is the data traversing from one side to another. So of course, at first you need to decide what data you will be collecting and, well, in what way. Like, let's say maybe you have SNMP devices, then you would probably want to execute SNMP checks. Maybe those are servers or workstations, then you can of course use Zabbix agent in passive or active mode, or maybe some simple checks to just ping the device, and a lot of different options to how to collect the metrics or why Zabbix help, or how to push data to the Zabbix server. When the data gets to the Zabbix server, it's of course getting analyzed, checked. For example, if you have already triggers for this data, that no trigger should fire, that data is as expected, not below or above any thresholds you provide, and so on. If it is, then of course you will be notified via any means that you chose to be notified with. And overall, of course, all the data, all the changes, all the alerts, all the events, all the trending changes will be eventually be saved to the database and visualized in the front end, so you can actually see in the front end how something changed across time in the past and to what values it led in the end. And not only that, you will see beautiful graphs, you will see network maps, let's say, of your infrastructure, to actually understand where exactly something is located and, for example, what location exactly is affected by some kind of problem that is happening with your infrastructure. And how often does Zabbix collect metrics? How often Zabbix checks the statuses? Well, as often as you need. It is possible to execute the checks as often as, let's say, each second. But of course, if you want to do it, let's say, every minute, every 5 minutes, every hour, or just once a day, that's also absolutely possible. Even moreover, you can define different frequency periods. Like, for example, you can check something maybe a bit more often on the working days in the working time, maybe a bit less on the weekends since, for example, nobody is in the office and it's not quite critical. If something, well, will be, let's say, out of work for a bit longer, but you need to still, and you want to save, let's say, save the space in the database in the long run. Or you're just, well, do not want to get a lot of information on the weekend. And of course, if, let's say, you want to monitor some specific locations, like, let's say, stores, and you want to just check them twice a day, like if the store was open, like, let's say, the cash register, and then you want to see if the if the store was closed at some specific time, like, let's say, at the end of the working day at 6, then you can execute daily scheduled checks, like, let's say, at 9 o'clock and at 6 o'clock. You can also execute scheduled checks once a week or even once a month if you wish. Zabbix is absolutely flexible in terms of how often you want and can actually execute checks. So starting with 1 second and ending, like, let's say, once a month, it's absolutely possible for different types of intervals. Okay, so we can collect the data as much as we want. We can collect it in any way we want. There are no limitations. We already got that. But how to detect the problems in the incoming data flow, since you can be, again, collecting a lot of information and, well, just going and checking each item separately, let's say, for the latest data and seeing if it actually reports something is, well, I can guess not the best solution you can imagine. That's why Zabbix has triggers. Trigger itself is as simple as it might be in terms of definitions. It's a problem definition. So basically, you can imagine it as, let's say, some item maybe is outperforming or overperforming. So the values that are being received are being above the thresholds or too much below the threshold. If we're talking about the simplest example that comes to mind is, of course, let's say, the CPU load. So let's say if our system CPU load is bigger than 90%, 95%, or bigger than 5 in terms of Linux metrics, then we would probably want to get an alert. And this example right here just shows you that if the last value for the system CPU load was about 5 on some server, then the trigger should fire, I should be notified about the situation, I should know what is happening and, well, that this specific situation is happening. More or less are not the only operators you can use for the triggers themselves. There are a lot more. You can make some mathematical simple equations like with minus, plus, with division, with multiplying. You can use operators like less than, more than, equal, not equal, more or equal, and less or equal, and of course not or and. So you can either even compare multiple items to a specific threshold or to a specific value that might occur in what you're collecting. There are a lot of different functions, so much that I actually would recommend to check out the documentation when you are struggling to see, what should I use if I want to check and I want to monitor if there are problems with this specific metric. So there are some of visible right here on the slide. So the min for the minimal values, the max for the maximum, average for the averages, of course, last for the last value received, count when we are trying to count if some specific values had arrived, let's say, more often than expected. Like, let's say you see a warning message in the log file, and the warning message itself, once a minute, doesn't mean that maybe something absolutely critical is happening. But let's say if you're receiving 5 warnings during a minute, then the trigger should fire, and you can make a trigger like that. Date, you can actually schedule the problematic dates for the triggers, the time, so you can provide the time, the difference, the regular expressions, and a lot more. There's a big list of what you can check with the help of triggers. And with the triggers, you can analyze basically everything. You can analyze any metric from any host and even more. You can do that with one trigger, not just creating multiple triggers. Like, let's say, for example, if the system CPU load on node 1 was more than 5 and on node 2 last received value was also above the 5 and TPS on, let's say, the both nodes, the last TPS received is below the 5,000, well, then the trigger should fire. And even more conditions are possible to provide in the trigger itself. So, of course, the simplest trigger would be the performance one. And why is it performance one? Not just because we actually monitor the performance, but because it's the fastest trigger for Zabbix to evaluate. It's just basically checking, hey, if the last value received is above 5, then you should fire. And the last value is just one value, so we're basically checking the latest value received, comparing to the threshold we provided. Not much to calculate, a simple comparison. But this usually leads to flopping. What is flopping? In Zabbix terms, flopping stands for trigger actually firing, and then extremely fast it is resolved. And then again firing, and then again getting resolved. Why? Because you use the last function, and the last function again checks the last value, and if the value hops around, like let's say it can be with the CPU load, since CPU load can be at one moment above 90% and the next moment below 50, and well, we can understand that that's not a real problem. But Zabbix is calculating quite roughly in this case, but quite precisely. So we will see flopping, again trigger firing and being resolved since the problem is over. Well, in a good situation maybe once a minute, but in not so good we could see the flopping just for every second, creating a lot of problem events, maybe even worrying the users that work through the Zabbix frontend about what is actually happening. And flopping occurs most often when you use specifically the function last, like we see here, because each time the last value received is above 5, the trigger will fire and will create a warning event, and will even notify you if you have an action that, well, says you should be notified when this trigger fires. But then CPU suddenly falls below, much below the threshold, but then again fires. So it would be just flopping depending on each value, and this can lead to a lot of events happening while there are maybe no critical problem. There's also a way, of course, to check the availability, not only the performance, and well, the performance still, even though it can potentially lead to last, be used with the last function. Still, it is quite precise and can be a bit more precise and less flopping in this at the same time. But again, absolutely not obligatory, since as you can see, the NetTCP service HTTP basically checks the status and returns ones and zeros, so available or not. And again, since HTTP service can be, for example, having, well, bit problems or maybe reporting not, let's say, so correctly, you could see flopping and see a lot of events being created in your front end and stored in your database, and even a lot of notifications can be sent to you about the situation happening. So again, even though it is, last is quite easy to calculate trigger, still it can lead to a lot of unnecessary flops. So, and a lot of flopping leads to what? To false positives. And what does false positives do? Basically, they make us a bit numb to the alerts, and we don't want that. So we want to make the trigger expressions as precise as possible to get notified only when there is actually some kind of problem happening with our instances, and when we actually need to do something about it and resolve the problem. So don't make your triggers too sensitive. Try to make a trigger as precise as it can be in terms of, well, is there a real problem or it's not. So how to avoid them? What can you do except just listening to me saying configure your triggers properly? Well, at first, of course, for yourself, define what really is a problem. What does it really mean that system is overloaded? What does it really mean that application doesn't work, service is not available, disk actually is full, and so on. So you need to check the real metrics, how they are, what would you consider to be a problem, and of course after that you need to figure out for yourself what is the real problem for each of those metrics. Why? Well, let's take a look at some examples right here. Like, let's say you have a trigger that says free disk space is below 10%, means there is a problem with the system itself. But as soon as the available space becomes above 10%, even by 1000, it will be resolved. But is it actually resolved? Unfortunately, no, it is not. Or let's say the CPU load is above 5 and you exactly monitor that, so the trigger fires. But then CPU load falls below 5, so to 4.99. Is it really solved? Probably not. Or again, availability checks. So SSH check failed, but again, the problem solved, SSH is up. So is it really? Maybe SSH actually crashes, maybe something else happens, maybe you should pay attention, maybe you're not. So you need to define precise Zabbix reaction points to the situation that is happening with your infrastructure right now. How can we do that? Well, we of course can analyze history in Zabbix, so we can use all the values that we already collected at some point, and we can make Zabbix actually calculate, well, more precisely what is the current situation with whatever devices we are monitoring. So like, let's say we are monitoring performance, and since CPU tend to spike, we can change the minimal value. We can choose the function that we use from last to min, which stands for minimal, and make Zabbix report, for example, if the current CPU load is more than 5 for at least 10 minutes, and it's the minimal value over those 10 minutes, well then, Zabbix needs to notify only then, and as you can see, this will make it much more precise in terms of reporting that the problem is actually there. For availability, this can be a bit other. We can use the maximal value and let's say check if on our service HTTP service is reporting zeros for 5 minutes and is the maximum value received for 5 minutes, then the trigger should fire. We can use not actually only the time period for the functions, we can actually use the specific number of values that we consider making the calculation of is there a problem or not more precise. For that we can use the hash, and in this case exactly this stands for the maximal value for the latest free values received is equal to 0, and then the trigger will fire. How does it help? Well, we can see an example right here. So with the usual last method we would see trigger firing at least 3 times and then being resolved again at least 1, 2, 3 times too. And we don't want that, we want as less as possible. So we decided to use the minimum value for the last 10 minutes. And then we can see the Zabbix will actually calculate what it is receiving, and if it sees that over approximately 10 minutes the minimum value for some specific metric is about 5, or like in this case the CPU load, the trigger will fire only after those 10 minutes pass, and after those 10 minutes report value about 5, and it will be resolved only at the point where the minimal value for 10 minutes will be below 5. How that would work with HTTP? Well, quite in a similar way. So we use count values this time, and we check if the maximum value for HTTP service state was 0 3 times at least, then Zabbix will start the trigger only when the free values are equal to 0, and the problem will be firing in the front end and will be notifying you as long as the last the maximum value for the free values corrected is 0. But there are again different conditions for problems and recovery. So before we actually used only the trigger expression itself, and by default the trigger expression is basically the recovery exception if we don't define a specific recovery expression. What does that mean? That means system CPU load lost about 5, as we already saw, leads to problem, and system CPU load when it goes down below those 5, like let's say even again those 4.99, well then the trigger stop firing. With recovery expression, Zabbix needs to check if the conditions are actually met, the recovery expression is actually met, and only then the problem will be resolved. And as you can see an example here, we are again checking the last value received for the CPU load, about 5, but then we create the actual recovery expression which checks if the last value received was below or equal to 1. And how does that look like? Well, as you can see, even better, since the problem will start just as soon as the value goes above 5, and it will be firing until it falls again down below or specifically to 1. And you will create basically not those 4, 3, 5 events in terms of problem happening, but only one for the actual problem start and another one for the problem being resolved. So quite simple and as efficient as it gets. Don't forget that means that basically no false positives will be created and everything will be as precise as it can be, saving you not only the nerves, not only the gray hair, but actually also saving you some space in the database in terms of the amount of events created in the database. So let's take a look at some more examples. System is overloaded. Problem definition would be a nice one. Let's say system CPU load is about 3 for 5 minutes, and about 3 is the minimum value. Recovery expression for that can be the maximum value for 2 minutes was less or equal to 1. No free need space. Maybe we should define specifically that even if at some point there was less than 10% of free space available, then we will define that when the space is above 30%, at least 15 minutes, and that's the minimum value for those 15 minutes, then only the problem should be resolved. Or SSH is not available, so we are checking the TCP service SSH maximal value for free checks basically states that it's 0. Then we will trust SSH again when the actual state of the service will be fine, will be 1 for at least 10 checks, and it will be the minimum value received for those 10 checks. So there are also a possibility of something not just performing out of completely blue. There are sometimes, and usually in real life, something, the performance of the device, if we monitor it from the past, we see that at some point it started leading to the situation that actually happened. And Zabbix can actually calculate the performance and compare performance from different periods in terms of whether too different, for example, and maybe if the device starts to become overloaded and outperforming. So basically, again, Zabbix can detect anomalies in the performance of any metric that you are monitoring. How? Well, for that you need to, of course, basically compare two trigger functions. And let's say if we want to compare the average CPU load for the last hour with the CPU load for the same period but from a week ago, and check if the current one is, well, not 2 times bigger than for the previous week, then we would need to use a function like that. So average 1 hour, average for 1 hour for the system CPU load is bigger, is 2 times bigger basically than the same load, the same average load for 1 hour, but from 7 days ago. And how that would work like? Well, quite efficiently. So if it checks, Zabbix check basically compares the values that it collected a week ago for the same hour and checks the values that it collected currently for the hour. And as soon as it sees that those are 2 times different, only then the trigger will fire, and you will know that the device is either becoming overloaded or maybe is overperforming overall and more resources are now being used. So you can see that, and maybe you can do and act with some preventive measures before the actual problem happens. We can also make Zabbix actually forecast for us, basically see the future in terms of what or when we will reach a certain threshold value. So the forecast function itself specifically tries to forecast when we will reach a certain threshold value, calculates it for us, and warn us when this period is all that is remaining before the problem actually happening. Or we can make Zabbix calculate a value after a certain time, so we can make Zabbix draw graphs in terms of how soon some or how will some value change after, let's say, 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, but basically how it will change over the time passing. This we can do with the forecast again. So okay, basically what we understood, we need to use history. We will need use history tables specifically to calculate the triggers to see that, well, something is performing as it should or not. And does it actually affect the performance of Zabbix? Of course it does. We are working with the values from the past, but the newer the version, the less it actually affects the performance of Zabbix. Why? Because, well, some of the values are just plain simply kept not only on the Zabbix server and not extremely fastly, but again, quite fast are put in the Zabbix database. Some of them are being in the cache, and Zabbix, as much as possible, tries to work with that cache before actually pulling the information from the database. We can also create dependencies to hide maybe related problems, but not the actual main problems. So as an example, those can be, let's say we're out of free disk space on some of the machines. But the trigger we see is CRM is not working. And well, we see the trigger firing and we would probably start checking out what's wrong with the CRM. Okay, we have created an additional dependency. Let's say the database is unavailable. And we added it for the CRM is not working. And then if DB is unavailable, the trigger CRM not working won't be firing because we would see that DB is unavailable. And that means that's the main issue we should react and not just opening CRM and trying to refresh it and clear the cache or whatever. But DB isn't available because there's no free disk space. So you can create a dependency for that trigger DB is unavailable, no free disk space, and when that trigger no free disk space will be firing, DB is unavailable trigger won't be showing you warnings, so you won't have to worry too much about, well, everything going absolutely in the wrong direction. Okay, so we can detect problems, we can detect them quite easily, we can detect almost everything, but how to display those problems? How can we actually see information about the problems that are currently happening? Quite simply, we just open Zabbix frontend in case frontend doesn't look familiar for you in this picture. Maybe you haven't yet seen 5.0. This is 5.0. This is how it looks like. And it was redesigned to actually show you a better output. So the section problems. What do we have in the section problems? Let me just close up a bit to go over it. We have, of course, the time of when the problem starts, the severity of the ongoing problem, what the host is affected, what is the name of the problem. We can see here a speech bubble with a question mark. Basically, that's some description to the problem itself. And of course, duration of the problem. Was the problem acknowledged? Were there any actions executed by the Zabbix or by maybe some of the users of the Zabbix frontend? And of course, the tags. So all the tags that you use to actually make it more understandable what is affected by the problem that you see in the problem section. So what tags those can be? There can be quite a lot. In 5.0, tags are basically everywhere on the hosts level, on the template level, on the on the template level, but specifically for the triggers themselves and so on. So you can create tag words and provide them with specific meanings to make the actual description of the problem much more understandable in terms of, for example, where the device is located, what specifically is affected, the performance, the availability, or the security. What's the environment, is it impacting the users or not, or you can, of course, and even those are, create whatever you see fit to use as filters, for example. So additionally, you can, of course, use useful information in the tags or names, like let's say, for example, you can actually use a macro item value and substitute with the reg sub to show you a more clear picture of what exactly is happening and what does phrase service item value reg sub stop mean. It means the train controller module wide port has gone to failed state, closure 0, slot 0, and instead, well, seeing just a name that isn't describing the problem that's happening thoroughly enough. Okay, we can detect problems in a lot of different ways, but how to react to those problems? Well, we can use the event correlation. There are two different event correlations in Zabbix, the trigger-based event correlation and the global event correlation. We can atomize the problem solving, of course, so we can make Zabbix actually execute some kind of scripts. We can provide Zabbix with specific custom scripts. We can, of course, choose who will execute those scripts, like let's say Zabbix agent or Zabbix server or Zabbix proxy. And those can be not only scripts, those can be actual SSH commands, telnet commands, IPMI requests, depending on what exactly is affected by the problem and how do we want to react to that problem. Then, of course, the manual problem closing, the simplest way, but again, the manual problem closing, even though it's possible for every trigger, if the problem is not really resolved, there's no really point of closing the trigger, since it will be reopened, since the Zabbix will receive values that are in scope of the problem and will immediately react to that accordingly to the setup it has. We can, of course, send notifications to different users, to different, let's say, levels of support, to the management, to the administrators, to the network administrators, Linux or whatever, depending on who is more relevant in terms of being notified about the problem that is happening. And then with integration with the web hooks, there are a lot of also help desk basically integrations, which can be suited quite simply. And the templates of those with the simple instructions on how to install it are also available. So you can basically register a ticket for the problem that is currently happening in Zabbix frontend in your own system, like let's say Jira or ServiceNow. So, but first let's talk about the event correlation on the trigger level. So what is it, and I would say how is it? Trigger-based event correlation basically allows to correlate separate problems that are reported or being reported by one trigger. How does that work? Well, generally an OK event basically closes all the problems that were created by one trigger. There are some cases when we need to do a bit more except just closing, well, everything, like let's say if we are monitoring logs. And with the event correlation on trigger level, you can, for example, close firing problems individually based on the matching tag. So in other words, the same trigger can create separate events that are identified by the event tag, and then you can just close them, those problems, by the usage of the tags. So let's take a look how does that looks like. So for example, a trigger is notifying us that service Jira was stopped and generates a problem in the front end. Then another problem fires with a similar trigger that service MySQL stopped. But then we see that service MySQL started, and with the event correlation, we can, for example, make this trigger being resolved while the service Jira stopped still actually working. Then we have service Redis stopped. But as soon as it will be started, it will be resolved. So how does it basically work? We've seen examples with the usual reaction, but with Jira that would be also, as you can see, the Jira was in the problem, but as soon as it started, the problem was resolved. But there are also global event correlation rules to do that for everything on the global level. Since global event correlation allows you to reach out over basically all the metrics that are created in Zabbix and which are related in some way, and well, some correlations are configured on them. So basically the global event correlation allows you to let's say, untie yourself from one trigger-based problem and resolution logic, and basically you can resolve problems on a global scale without actually going, let's say, and clicking and rechecking each problem separately. So in the usual, how does it work? You have existing problem and existing problems, a new problem appears, and you don't have, let's say, any correlation rules, or do you have any? How that would change the reaction of Zabbix to the problem? So if no correlation rules, we would see that the newly generated problem just got added to the bunch of other problems we already had. If we configure close an existing problem with event correlation, then as soon as this problem happens, it will close all the existing problems that are related to this problem on the tag level. If we close a new problem, not the old one, well, it will close only the new problem that was just generated by some trigger. And if we want to actually escalate, so we want to execute specific set of actions when the problem happens, what can we do? We can, of course, provide an immediate reaction, like send a message instantly as soon as the problem happens. We can execute a delayed reaction, so give Zabbix some time to see how the situation changes, and if it doesn't, let's say, and if it's still in problem state, then Zabbix should notify someone after 10 minutes of persistent problem. Notification if automatic action actually failed, so you will get a notification about that. Repeat notification, so you can basically send notifications as much as you want, but make sure not to overdo it and spam somebody off. And of course, escalation to a new level. So basically escalating the problem further to a more plausible resolution. So how that would look like, let's say we have a critical problem, and instantly we notify everyone by sending repeated email. Nobody reacts, problem is there after 5 minutes, then we send a short message and create a ticket in our favorite ticket system. 10 minutes has passed from the beginning of the problem, and even though that everyone got notified, almost, problem is still there. We can make Zabbix execute a command like restart a service or a server, or I don't know, power cycle whole room to try and fix the problem automatically. And if it will be, of course, you will get a recovery notification stating that everything is fine, problem is resolved, and the trigger, well, will be closed as there is no problem anymore. But if that doesn't help, you can send some short message to the messenger and to the manager, sorry, and then, of course, to the boss itself. Just to mention, you can get notified not only via emails. There are a lot of more to use. You can use Discord, you can use Telegram, you can use Slack to get notified and to stay in touch with your monitoring and your infrastructure. So let's summarize everything that we have heard today. Don't forget to analyze history. Since analyzing history, of course, there's no point maybe to analyze history for a month, but again, it depends on what is the metric and how often it changes. But overall, sure, analyze the history to make the alarms firing as precise as it gets. No problem doesn't mean there is a solution, like we saw with the disk space, and if there is not specifically, let's say, 10% free but 10.001% free, is it really precise as you hoped it would be? Use different conditions for problem definition and recovery. Why? Because that makes the reaction more precise and more of what you would expect to be a problem recovery. Pay attention to anomaly detection, since it might save you from some devices stopping work when you least expect it, since with the anomaly detection you will be noticing when something starts to under or overperform. Don't forget to use correlation to see only what is necessary to see and what is the actual problem, not just names of the triggers, let's say. Try to resolve common problems automatically when it's possible, so just make Zabbix execute the simplest commands or scripts that, well, most of the time simply and fast enough solve the problem without you, let's say, actually getting to the office. And do not hesitate to escalate. So if you see a problem and you see it being, and you know it can be seen in the front end happen quite a long period of time, make sure that you escalate to as much trusted person as you can who will try to resolve the problem that is happening. So let me remind you of our Zabbix services. It's of course the technical support, the professional training, which is now being introduced as online training, the upgrade procedure. So if you have an old Zabbix version, we would be happy to upgrade that Zabbix for you to the newest one. Development, have some custom features that you really miss and you really need them. Well, reach for us and we will try to figure out something with our development team. Integrations in terms of, let's say, adding additional maybe messaging, maybe ticketing, maybe service desk systems to your Zabbix. Remote troubleshooting. So you see a problem that you cannot resolve for a long time and, well, you actually understand you might need help. We are here for you and just, again, send a request. And the same goes for the template building, the turnkey solution. So if you don't use Zabbix yet and you don't know where to start, well, you can contact us and we will help you to start, and we will even together perform a ready-to-use solution for your infrastructure. Well, even though currently there's not much that traveling happening, but we do expect very strongly that in October we and you and everyone will be able to travel as much as possible while feeling safe. So we do invite you to the Zabbix Premier event that will happen on October 30th to join us, to discuss Zabbix, to talk with developers, talk with the engineers, and everything that is related to Zabbix. So you can receive an answer to any questions that you might have, so we can assist you with whatever is needed. And of course, if you haven't seen Zabbix yet, you can always see our visual demo, which is available on the link zabbix.com/demo, or even request a live demo with our engineers, and we will, of course, show you each part of the Zabbix and tell you about each part of the Zabbix. And let's get to the second main event of this webinar, except this webinar itself, is the questions. So I will be collecting emails. So remember, if you want to receive the slides, give me your emails in the chat, preferably. And of course, share your questions and I will answer them while I will be collecting the emails themselves. And while this is happening, I will start to collect the emails. And looking for the questions too, of course. So looking for those questions, there we go. Suppose I have an SLA defined in Zabbix based on a trigger that depends on another. If the underlying trigger fires, but not the dependent one, will SLA be affected? So will the SLA counter be affected? If that affects basically the end service, then yes, it will be affected. Can I do topology-based correlation? You can, if the topology somehow is addressed in the trigger, the event tags themselves. When I can I find best practice how to set triggers for items? DB, Q, CPU, C. You can find some examples in the documentation, of course, in the slides that was seen through this webinar. So you can request the slides and I can send them to you. But again, you cannot find like maybe absolutely the best practice, since some of the items tend to be quite personal to the infrastructure that in which they are used. Sorry, I have a question regarding post-install configuration. I have described my issue and I haven't had any luck. Unfortunately, I cannot copy links from the Q&A section, so I won't be able to answer that. I'm very sorry. Could you describe the whole end-to-end process and what is needed from problem on item to send email? Well, yes, of course I can. So basically, you will need to create an item. You will need to create a trigger for that item. To check, let's say, again, that the item sends what you expect it to send. And for example, if it sends something bigger or less or not what it should, then you, as I understand, should want to get notified. For that, you create an action which can be done in the configuration actions. There you go to the trigger actions and create a condition saying like, let's say, if this trigger is firing, do the next steps, and then you create the operations that you want Zabbix to do. But again, that's in the simple way. So basically, create an item, create a trigger for an item, then create a trigger action, which will involve this trigger as condition. If I need to customize some triggers that are provided by template, what should I do? Then, well, how do you mean customize? You want to customize them for a host, or you want to customize them for all the hosts that use this template? Please provide the emails in the chat because unfortunately, again, I cannot copy paste from the Q&A section. Is there a way to debug dependencies? What do you mean debug dependencies? To test if they will work or not? Well, the simplest way would be, of course, to simulate the problematic metrics receival with some of the triggers. Hello, I'm interested in baseline monitoring. How does it work? Well, you can use them with something like trends, for example. Let me just check if it was completely. No, it wasn't completely implemented, the baseline monitoring, but it should be in 5.2, I assume. Sometimes we have different servers with different disk sizes. Just 20% is different from each other. How can we personalize it? Use user macros, and you can change user macro on the host level, and then each host level will have its own threshold, since the thresholds can be also provided inside the user macros. Issues that I can configure SNMP interface in Zabbix server. I have tried in Red Hat. What do you mean you cannot configure? It is quite simply configured. Usually it's SNMP configuration problems, not Zabbix, but maybe if you can do a bit more information, maybe I can answer something. Is there any plan to introduce IOPS in Zabbix? I'm afraid I cannot answer that, but you can send this question to the sales that at Zabbix.com. I will show the contents later, and we will try to answer that in a timely manner. Any idea on how to monitor Zabbix itself like an independent satellite probe? There are built-in internal metrics that are monitored by default when you just install the Zabbix. So you can use those to monitor the performance of Zabbix, or you can use another Zabbix to monitor your Zabbix. That's also possible, and there is a good text on that in the documentation. I believe it's easy to hide some important alerts with dependencies that are badly full. Of course, you can always break something if you are configuring something incorrectly, but that's true for everything. That's why, well, basically you need to try and see and revisit whatever you have configured. Has the future host-based dependencies been implemented? Again, I cannot copy the links, so if you want for me to check some links, well, get them to the chat, guys, please. Correlation of events. For example, we have website check database and ping test. How can I prevent trigger database and website monitoring when I know that ping isn't reachable now? That sounds like three different items with the three different triggers. So I'm not sure, or do you have like one trigger for all of that? Can you maybe describe a bit more? This sounds like an incomplete information. As soon as hit update, again, the connection was reset. The connection to the server was reset while the page was loading. The site could be as soon as you hit update. Update what and where? Since the upgrade is basically performed on the CLI, so could you maybe understand it a bit more, describe it a bit more? How to discover and monitor Docker containers. For that, I would recommend to view the Kubernetes webinar, since there all the points are covered quite thoroughly. I'm sorry. So well, the idea of baseline monitoring itself is an automatic problem and anomaly detection based on analysis of history data. to actually not provide any manual setting of thresholds. So basically, the Zabbix, the idea is with baseline monitoring, the monitoring system will itself look over how the metrics perform, what is the usual baseline, like let's call it an average, and we'll calculate automatically based on the history data. Can we search for a string on an HTTP document? For example, I'm on a page that should return a number that should be higher than X. Yes, you can with HTTP agent or web checks, and then you can provide a specific string to look for. I'm not sure I understand. How does one make the server SNMP trap receiver? There is a article and documentation on how you can make your server an SNMP trap receiver. SNMP walk and SNMP get and SNMP traps are, well, okay. SNMP walk and SNMP get is basically a polling request. SNMP traps is pushing data, so they are quite different, and they even work on different ports, so you cannot compare them. You can, but not in that way. Is there any template there? I'm not sure. You can try to check it on share.zabbix.com about what templates are there or not, or to our Zabbix homepage. So we want to monitor some services at a remote location. We plan to use Raspberry Pi and agent. How can we make that we don't get alerts during no connection for all services, but only the connection? So do you mean if, for example, the Raspberry Pi is down, but not the devices behind it is down? Well, you can use event correlation or dependencies for it, just as well it was. I want to add additional expression triggers for database and website that check it. You can add that additional expression. Yes, of course, you can use multiple expressions with multiple items in one trigger. So guys, we are a bit out of time. We'll start collecting emails, getting error on slow queries, probably because of we won't analyze slow queries over here. Sorry, that's a bit too much. So I do understand that you have a lot of questions. If you want to ask to analyze queries, then you would need to contact one of those emails, and we can work out what we can do for you. So those are the contacts that you can send all the unanswered questions to, because we are a bit out of time. I will try to answer something else while I'll be collecting emails, because I've seen somebody mention that he shared some kind of link in the chat from the forum, but there was, I guess, two, so I will need to check out. The most often reason about the slow queries is non-optimized database or Zabbix itself. But the one that I see looks more like the front-end query, so maybe you have a lot of users or a lot of API requests. So for now, I am collecting all the emails. There's a lot. So it probably will take me some time to collect them. What do you mean dynamically? You can change the trigger settings at any given moment, but if the trigger is already fired, then of course it won't be affected by the changes. And well, the monitoring of the influx databases, etc., ClickHouse is supported. In terms of backend usage, no, not yet. The only major changes, of course, the possibility of using timescale DB, compression of timescale DB, and the IBM DB2 support was dropped. In terms of slides and video, especially slides, please refer only to Zabbix. I'm pretty sure it would be quite strange if somebody else would send you the slides. Are there any other online links to training sessions? Yes, of course, through our webpage, zabbix.com, there's quite a lot. Thank you for the kind words. I hope you did like the webinar. The trigger will register an event even if they are closed by a correlation. Yes, they will be just automatically closed. So the event will fire, but it will be automatically closed, and only the main event will be visible. Getting error of type string is not supposed to work. This seems like misconfiguration with the items. I'm using Zabbix 3.4 and occasionally the graphs disappear. I would recommend you to update your Zabbix as soon as possible since 3.4 is not even supported anymore. Yeah, I saw your forum link, but again, there's a bit too much to troubleshoot to just solve it over a webinar, which, well, is out of time already. How to configure SNMP jobs from VMware or specific OIDs? Well, you just configure SNMP items and provide specific OIDs you want to receive values from. So, guys, we are finished for today. I've answered quite a lot of questions. Sorry if I wasn't able to, well, answer all of them. Again, feel free to contact us with your questions right here. Some of the issues are unfortunately not too easy enough to solve them over a 2-minute answer, I would say even, and would require a much bigger troubleshooting. But still, you can resend it to sales.zabbix.com. We'll see what we can do. So thank you everyone for your time, and I hope to see you on the other webinars. Bye bye everyone.